So we have a set of Weber 40 IDTP carburetors that were sent to us. Okay, so I'm going to start with the top plate. First thing I want to do is get the top pieces of brass off. Now these are usually rock hard, so we're not even going to try to undo things. We're just going to go ahead and cut this in half right there, and then we'll undo those hose clamps. A lot of the times these have been on here since the dawn of time, and even if you do undo them, you'll never get them apart. So usually the way that I will do it is I'll create a trash pile. So any gaskets that are coming out, I'm not going to reuse. I'll just kind of push them off to one side. On the banjo bolts, these filters we're also not going to reuse. We'll put in new ones. And the way to get these off is you just have to kind of screw them over the threads. They need to be a somewhat tight fit, and they'll go into our trash pile. Then brass that we want to keep and clean, we're just going to start over here. Now another thing, these usually won't come off when they're rock hard, so I just take my set of cutters, and you want to be careful that you don't damage up the sealing surface, but you can see how the hose is just kind of breaking up. That goes in our trash pile, and that in our brass. Okay, before we start taking the top plate off, I always want to remove my jet covers. Now if you try and use a wrench on these, what usually happens, because the wrench can only get a certain bite on it, it doesn't get the full head on there, is you will tend to slip off, especially if these are tight, which often they are. For me, I found the best way to handle them is to use an impact gun and a 6-point socket. This is a 16mm socket. What it does is it allows me to put down pressure, and then it's going to come off. Now these are another source of leaks, and more often than not I will not reuse these plugs. Like this one, this is a 1/2-inch impact gun, and it had to work way harder than it should have done, so it means it's been over tightened. For right now, I'll put it in our brass pile. You can see on this filter here, it's just kind of, it's all crumbling and falling apart. This is why we don't reuse these. Even if they look good, it doesn't take much for them to break up. And then that gets, because it's inside the fuel system already, we have our needle and seat right here. It's going to end up in there, which is going to cause the engine to flood. Sometimes these gaskets can get pretty stuck on here, like this one. I can't seem to get a good bite on it, so I'll come back to it in a second. So as you can see, these gaskets get pretty squashed. So what I had to do was get it to where it would actually thread off, because it's grown into the threads. Okay, before we take the tops off, I'm going to go ahead and pull the needles and seats out of both tops. It's easier to hold the carburetor and deal with it now than take the top off first. So it's going to come down into my socket. You can see the last guy that put them in thought that they were holding the entire engine together. Okay, needle and seats are typically replaced. We can see an idea of what's going on. You can see the corrosion in here, and this is more than likely just from sitting around. Okay, so a couple of things that are going to give us some clues to what's been going on with this. We have all different heights when it comes to needle and seat setup. So this one, we've got a lot of height, looks like about 2 1.5 millimeter washes in there, so that's probably 3 millimeters where they've tried to raise the float level in that chamber. We have one here that looks like about a 1 millimeter shim. This one has a 1 millimeter and looks like a 0.25, so strange height there. And then this one has like a 2 millimeter here. So whatever's been going on in these carburetors, they've been neglected or misadjusted for a very long time. Next, we're going to take off our top plates. We've got everything stripped out of the top. I'm just going to use an M8 quarter drive socket on the end of my driver. You do not keep the nuts at all. These should be nylocks, in which case they're a one-time use, so you want to throw those in the trash. And then there's going to be a flat washer. I find it's cheaper to just replace the flat washer than it is to try and sand those out and have them replated. So they'll typically all go in the trash pile for me. Okay, with all the nuts out, that plate should just go ahead and lift up. I'm going to dump all my flat washers. Let's stick this right here. These will go straight into my trash pile. Okay, let's catch the other one up first. Barely touch it and it falls apart. Okay, so a couple of things. If we see on our top plates here, this is very common for these to come loose. They've also been cleaned in the past and all of the plating is gone, and so they're starting to rust. And what will happen when the engine's running, these will sit here wiggling around and they will actually hog this hole out even more. So if you are going to replate this surface, which we are, we're going to recoat it in the original anodizing. All the steel needs to be out of it, including these pieces. The way that they are held in is they are just pushed in and peened in from the bottom. So the way I get them out is very simple. I'm going to clamp that in the vise and I'm just going to bend this back and forth a couple of times, which will break that peen and it'll pop out. So I've just clamped the pipe in my vise, and I don't care if I damage the pipe, I'm not going to reuse it. And I'm just going to pull the top back and forth, up and down. You see how it's closing in that peen section, and then it'll just slide right off. Simple as that. Does not take much effort, and you can see these are pretty rusty in there, so it's time to replace them anyway. When it comes down to our carburetor bodies, what we're looking at, you can see these are pretty nasty. They've been sitting around for quite a while. When you're pulling stuff out, you want to make sure that you use good quality screwdrivers, especially because things can be tight. And if you do want to reuse or save any of the brass, then you want to make sure you don't damage it any further. So, as I said before, you don't need your sandwich baggies or different containers. You just get them apart and stack like parts together. So I'm going to keep all of my accelerator pumps in one pile. And you can take one carburetor all the way down and then come and do the other one, or do it as you go. That's really up to you. Okay, that's all my pump jets. Next I'm going to go and pull my floats out. and then we'll take a look at our floats a little later. Normally there's a tie wire here, but these ones have been left off, whoever was in last. Not a big deal. We just want to undo the pivot arm. Excuse me. Pull the pivot arm out, and then the float will just tip up like that. We want to have a good look at our floats for any kind of damage. A lot of times you'll find these where they're collapsed in. That can be due to a lot of different issues. Most of the time it's because the floats are corroded and they've just lost any strength. You can see these ones have started to dent in at the top. Or other times you'll have people put compressed air into the carburetor, which can also collapse the floats if you're not careful. Okay, one of the things you'll notice, this is a later style float, so this float's been replaced before, but the float drop arm, and so to show you the difference, an early float does not have this second arm, and what this does is this stops the float from sitting on the bottom of the carburetor when it's completely dry, and this has been bent over so far that it could probably barely move correctly, and so you wouldn't have had much travel in this before it was switching on, switching off. That can create some problems. Alright, so with all the floats out, I'm going to go ahead and pop my main air correctors out next. Put them in a pile. Down inside next is our emulsion tubes. Sometimes they'll just pop out. We got one. We'll look at our calibration package later. If they do stick in, there's a couple of ways to get them out. The simplest way is if you just take an awl, put it in, put some pressure on it, they'll usually pop right out. If they are really stuck in there, then you can tap them with an M4 tap and put in an M4 screw and pull them out. You just want to be careful we don't break a tap off in the backs. To remove our auxiliary boosters, these can sometimes be really stuck. Normally you're just going to grab a hold of it and pull, and these ones are really stuck, so we'll have to tap them out from the bottom side. You want to be careful when you tap them out though that you don't damage them. We'll get to these in just a bit. These are the same, really stuck. Okay, just going to roll my carburetor over and keep taking the jet package out. So we've got idle jets, missing the O-rings, which is not the end of the world. Next, I'm going to pull my main jet carrier. Can't even read the main jet size right now, it's got so much corrosion on it. Okay, bowl plugs can come out. These have a tendency to break from corrosion, so usually I will replace these screws because there's nothing worse than doing it up when you're all done and having it snap off. These are the progression port hole covers. And that one's already missing. You can also see that our mixture screws here, somebody's already taken those out. So if they were still in, we would have popped them out. Mixture screws I generally do not keep. They would go straight in the trash pile. All right, I'm gonna pull our choke retaining screws. These ones still do have a tire wire, so we're just gonna go and cut that wire. Pull that out. These things are really sharp and they always tend to stab you, so you got to be somewhat careful. And then these are items where usually we will send these out to get replated. New ones are available, and it's really up to you whether or not it's cheaper or easier to buy new ones than it is to get them replated. Okay, the last thing is our air bypass screws on the front. So just going to crack the lock nut. Okay, so that's pretty much the front of the carburetor all stripped down. So one of the things you find with a 50-year-old set of carburetors is stuff like this, where this plug, which is a larger thread size in diameter, because obviously they either had a problem where this one broke off or they lost it at some point, and instead of buying the correct plug, they just grabbed whatever bolt they had laying around the shop and jammed it in. So in this one here, the front part of the threads where they've screwed this piece in is all hogged out. If we compare it to this side, you can physically see the size difference. So in this one, this is a unique thread. It's an M7x1. It's not a very popular thread today. We're going to have to do a thread repair in here before it goes back together. However, it has to be done after the body is replated, because otherwise, if we have any steel in there when it goes into the acid bath for the anodizing treatment, that steel will react and it will actually corrode away. So we've got pretty much all of our jets out, bulb plugs, everything on the front side and top side of the carburetor. Next thing we're going to work on is our throttles and our accelerator pump circuit. Now this is a common wear point, and we can see here how this linkage is moving backwards and forth. This is when you open the throttle, it pulls this rod which activates the accelerator pump on this pump can, and it's very common for wear in there. Typically I do not reuse any of these components. I will replace this ear, I will replace the rod assembly, and so we're going to go ahead and put that off right now. Normally there's a cotter pin located in on the end of this one. Somebody has left it out, so if you're unscrewing and all of a sudden it binds up, you need to remove the cotter pin from there. But we're just going to undo this, unhook it from our pump, and then the way that these come out is they have two little pinches there. On the aftermarket ones they'll have an E-clip. You can also see the amount of wear in here, how it's worn a pretty substantial groove. And I see my screwdriver get caught in it, so this part would be replaced anyways. And then if we look at the ear, even though it's dirty, it's a little hard to tell, it's egg-shaped. So this ear is worn out as well. Before I take my accelerator pump off with these 4 nuts, I want to drive this shaft out. This is the pivot shaft that the accelerator pump pivots on. It's very common for this to wear out. To do that, I'm just going to take my hammer, drive it forward, and you'll see it's popped out right there just a little bit. It has a nulled edge, and that stops it from rotating or popping out. And I'm just going to take my punch, punch that through. That way it gets our linkage off, so we can put that in our plate pile and pull our shaft off. We can see on the shaft where it's worn a groove right here and right here. This is from the pump lever pivoting on it, so we'll be putting in a new shaft. Even though these are not nylocks, I never reuse them, I always replace. and I actually replace them with a nylock nut. Okay, so there's our pump covers off. Diaphragm assembly, we're going to put a new one in, even though it's a pretty nice looking one. Spring we're going to put off to the side. This is our distribution housing or distribution block. It's going to be a gasket right here. This acts as a check valve right here, and this disc that has a spring on it puts pressure up against here. So when you hit the accelerator pump, fuel flows in, it pushes into here. It will allow this diaphragm to pop off of these 3 ports, allows fuel to flow into here. These go out to your accelerator pumps. So that out in the trash pile. We're going to keep the disc and our spring. Next we're going to go and pull out our throttle plates. So a couple of things to remember with these. Throttle plates from the factory are peened in. So that means on the underside of the screw, I'm not sure if you can see it, they have a center pop in them, and that actually spreads the screw out to stop them coming out. That's usually not a problem. I see some guys go in there and try and grind that off. Typically I just unscrew. Most of the times I'm not reusing the shaft, but even if you are going to reuse the shaft, you can clean the threads out with a M4 tap once it's out, and if the shafts measure up, reuse them. So to undo them, I want to get a good fit in on my screwdriver, and these will be tight. So cracked free, and then as it screws out, it's going to tighten up right there. So I'm going to have to kind of work it past. Actually, this one wasn't too bad. You can see on the screw on the end where it's been drilled, and it just literally snapped the peen head off. I don't reuse these, so they go in my trash pile. I want to make sure that your screwdriver head fits into the screw slot nice and tight. Then once you've got 2 screws out, if you hold the throttle plate, turn it 90 degrees, and just wiggle it out. Then throttle plates are one of those things that go straight in the trash, even if they're not drilled and soldered. They will wear on the sides here and here and here. Okay, the throttle plate needs to stay somewhat parallel to everything for it to come out, and sometimes they will get a little stuck, especially if you let the throttle drop down, or like this one, it has a lot of debris build up on the plate, so it got jammed in the throttle shaft. So sometimes you got to very carefully pry them out. You just don't want to damage the sealing surface. You can see a better look at the hole that they've drilled through the throttle plate right there. That's something that usually you won't encounter. Before we can pull the shaft out, our accelerator pump lever has to come out. So we've got a 2mm punch. So I want to start it, but this roll pin, if I keep driving it down, is just going to break its way into the bowl. So I just want to get it moving, and just until it pops out, and you can see it right there. That's because it's nice and easy. Then to take it out, I'm going to have to rotate the throttle. But to make it easier on me, I'm going to drop our throttle lever off, which will take the spring pressure off, so I don't have to try and hold the thing open while I'm driving it out. So to do that, if there is a locking tab on the front, we're just going to pop that locking tab off. If not, there's usually going to be a washer, or maybe just straight in. And we just want to pop that free. And then if we pull the linkage forward, it'll release the spring somewhere there, and it'll pop out. So we're going to pull out linkage out, that spring out, and there's also going to be a washer in here. Sometimes these washers can get jammed on pretty tight. This one's not too bad. So what that's done is it's released a lot of the spring pressure. We've still got a spring back here, but right now there's allowed enough for that throttle shaft to move. So I'm going to take my punch. And I'm just going to carefully drive that pin out like that. Now sometimes these can rust into place on the shaft. They're also drilled in place, so sometimes you have to kind of break them free. So what I'll do then is I'll just put my linkage on the front, and you can carefully tap it to break it free, and then we'll drive it out against the shaft there. Okay, we're going to remove our coupling. Okay, so I've got all the screws out of my coupling. So I'm going to start with the back shaft, and sometimes these can be pretty well jammed in because those set screws haven't moved in a long time. So it's going to take a small pair of channel locks and kind of rotate this. And I'm going to pull it at the same time. Okay. Release the spring. Okay, so this is our small throttle shaft. We're just going to set this off to the side, and we can measure these in just a minute and see if they're reusable or whether they need to be replaced. Same with our spring. On the front shaft, we're going to do pretty much the same thing. We're going to work the shaft forward. Sometimes this one can be just as stuck, so we want to be careful that we don't collapse it. Okay, so I used a small set of channel locks just to hold this. If you have to hold it right here. If you hold it up here or up here and you twist it and damage it, then it's not going to be reusable. And I just broke it free. I put the nut back on the front so I can pull, and I've just worked it forward. So now I can get it out. Now there are two types of couplings here. From 68 and on, they use this style coupling, which is very stable, secure, don't give us any troubles. On the early IDAs from 67, they used this wire fold as a coupling. What tends to happen with these is when you retighten here, they tend to crack and lose tension. Then what will happen when you open the throttle, the front throttle shafts will open, but the back throttle shaft doesn't move. If you ever come across these, just pull them out, throw them in the trash, and replace them with the latest style couplings. So what I want to do to get the front shaft out, we've cracked this free, but it's still kind of stiff. So I'm going to just hold that here, and I'm going to rock my shaft backwards and forth while I I've got my nut back here, so while I put pressure on it. Now there's a couple of things that I'm fighting. There's some buildup on the throttle shaft from engine debris that's making it sticky, as well as our pump lever. Okay, here we have, there's our pump lever. This is going to be in our trash pile. And here's our throttle shaft that needs to be cleaned and measured. So now we've got throttle plates and throttle shaft out of the way. We have a clear shot at our chokes. So what I usually do is I use my brass punch, and I just come in and lightly tap on them to see if I can break them free. And it didn't take a lot of force. We can see this one's popping up. You have to be very careful when you're doing this. What we don't want to do is damage this area. So if I took my punch and then just started laying into it with a hammer, and I peened and this all got swollen and flared out, then I'd have to replace it, because that'll change the airflow characteristics, which will change the main circuit characteristic. So you want to be very careful how you knock these out. So just light tapping is all they usually need. You can see there's corrosion on it. That's really the only thing that was holding it, here and here. And with some very light tapping, it was able to come out. And do the same for the rest. You can hear it change in note. Came out, no damage. Same with that side. Okay, last thing we have left is chokes. They will usually push out. Okay. If you ever have a set of chokes that are stuck inside the carburetor, you've got to be very careful if you try and tap them out. If you put a disc down in here and you tap into it, what will tend to happen, these are just cast aluminum, they'll expand up into the carburetor and make it even worse. So if you do have to tap them out, I've made up different size drivers that will fit all the way up on this portion, which is the thickest part of the choke. You don't ever want to really try and drive them there, you want to get up here. They also make a choke puller that comes in from the top and grabs here, though these days those are pretty hard to find. So now this one, the body's pretty much stripped out. We still need to pull out the studs. I still have my accelerator pump check valve. Let's go ahead and pop that out. It's down inside the bowl. This is the one-way valve for the accelerator pump circuit. Go with that brass. So I'm going to go ahead, catch up our second carburetor body, and then we'll look at pulling out the studs.